This is Chapter 12, Part C, on the central nervous system. So last section we mentioned the limbic system, how it was kind of the emotional portion of the brain. So these functional brain systems are just networks of neurons that are working together, but they're still going to span wide areas of overall brain function. So these include the limbic system and the reticular formation. So the limbic system is part of your emotional or your affective brain. So some components of the limbic system include the amygdala or the amygdaloid body. So this is kind of the fear center of your emotions. So it recognizes angry or fearful facial expressions, helps to assess danger and elicit fear response. So in some animals like mice, which are common prey animals, they have much larger amygdalas, so they're more skittish than we humans are. The cingulate gyrus is also part of the limbic system, shown here. So it plays a role in expressing emotions via gesture, so like body language. So that is also kind of an emotional component. So the limbic system is going to interact with those prefrontal lobes, so kind of your conscious brain. So this allows us to react emotionally to things that we can consciously understand to be happening. Also makes us just kind of aware of emotional richness in our lives. So the hippocampus and the amygdala also play a role in memory. So the hippocampus is involved in that transferring from short-term memory to long-term memory. And then last section, we talked about the olfactory bulb. So while it's not technically part of the limbic system, it does kind of cross paths with it. So this is why smell can be such a strong trigger of certain memories. So the reticular formation is another functional brain system. So it basically works to keep the cortex conscious and alert and to filter out repetitive or weak stimuli. So virtually 99% of all incoming stimuli is not even relayed to our consciousness, so it doesn't even register. So an example would be when you're driving down the road, right? Of course, you see the license plates of the cars in front of you and around you, but are you really going to remember what they were? No, your brain, your reticular formation is going to filter out that kind of non-important information and stimuli. So this is showing your sensory axons, sensory neurons are sending impulses to the brain, right, from the body. So kind of the main hub when these impulses reach the brain is going to be through that thalamus and the reticulation or reticular formation. So we're going to filter out some of the stimuli and we're going to relay and reroute other stimuli where they need to go. So auditory impulses are going to be delivered to the auditory center. Visual impulses go to the visual cortex. Right? So ultimately, this constant stream of incoming information helps to keep the brain aroused and alert. So some motor functions of the reticular formation also help to control our overall coarse limb movements. So we can also help regulate some autonomic centers like our visceral motor function, so like cardiac centers, respiratory centers, and vasomotor centers. So just kind of summary of the major brain regions we've covered so far, starting with the cortex, right, that cortical gray matter. It's going to interpret those sensory inputs and control all of your voluntary muscle activity. And it's really the source of your intellect, your intelligence, your emotional processing, right, your thoughts, your memories. The thalamus, part of that diencephalon, is going to relay those sensory impulses to their specific cortex region. So tied in with that reticular formation, kind of filtering out and redirecting impulses where they need to go. The hypothalamus, just below the thalamus, is primarily concerned with regulating your autonomic or involuntary systems. So things like body temperature, hunger, water balance, biological rhythms. So it regulates hormonal output of the pituitary gland. And it can also act as an endocrine organ itself and produces its own hormones as well. The limbic system, we said, was one of the functional brain systems, kind of your emotional brain. So it mediates emotional response as well as memory processing with the hippocampus. So the brain stem, we said, was kind of like your primitive brain, your lizard brain, primarily concerned with just keeping you alive, keeping your vitals stable. So the midbrain is the first region of the brain stem, contains a lot of the reflex centers, some subcortical motor centers, as well as visual and auditory reflex centers. The pons is going to mainly control the respiratory rate and depth. The medulla is going to contain some of your visceral nuclei for controlling some autonomic functions like heart rate, blood vessel diameter, blood pressure, breathing rate, as well as that vomiting center. Right, so we said it lacks that blood-brain barrier to kind of monitor the chemical composition of the blood to make sure there's no poisons or toxins. The reticular formation, kind of in conjunction with the thalamus, is going to work to just filter out repetitive, non-essential stimuli. And the cerebellum is going to help to plan and coordinate those smooth skeletal muscle movements. So some higher mental function analysis include things like language, memory, brain waves, EEGs, consciousness, and sleep-wake cycles. So the two main areas of the brain associated with language include the Broca's area, which we said was the motor speech region of the brain, and the Wernicke's area. So that would be in the association cortex, where we're now understanding and these written and spoken words. So if a patient has a lesion in this Wernicke's area, they can still speak, they can produce speech, so their Broca's area is fine, but their words don't make any sense. So they're not able to understand or translate that written or spoken language. So memory is the storage and retrieval of information. There are 4 different kinds of memory. Declarative memory was just like memory of facts, so rote memorization of names, faces, words, dates. Procedural memory is a memory of skills, so playing the piano or cooking. Motor memory is memory of a motor skill, so kind of a muscle memory, so how you never forget how to ride a bike. Emotional memory would be memory of experiences linked to an emotion. So kind of high emotional impact memories, sometimes called flashbulb memories, where they're kind of automatically transferred to that long-term storage. So the 2 stages of this declarative memory storage would be like short-term memory. So this is just temporary holding of information. And it's generally limited to 7 or 8 pieces of information. So this is why phone numbers are only 7 numbers long. We break up longer numbers into 3 to 4 number chunks. So long-term memory essentially has a limitless capacity, so you can always learn something new. You can always have new long-term memories stored. So some factors that affect this transfer process from short-term memory to long-term memory include, first of all, just your emotional state. So it'd be best if you were alert, awake, interested, motivated, excited about the material that you're trying to learn and commit to your long-term memory. Rehearsal is just repetition and practice. So this is when you study. So you study the material over and over again until you remember it. Association is when we can tie in new information with old memory. So this is a good learning technique if you can associate this new information with something you already know. So maybe you can retrieve that memory of what you already know, and it'll kind of lead you to the new information you're trying to learn. And then, like I said, automatic memory would be those high emotional type memories or flashbulb memories where it's just automatically to the long-term memory storage. But it doesn't even necessarily need to have an emotional impact. Sometimes just the subconscious information stored in long-term memory. So sometimes like when you can't get a commercial song out of your head or something stupid like that. Just kind of automatically, even without you trying or wanting it to, will be transferred to that long-term storage. So any damage to the hippocampus or the temporal lobe, basically where your memories are stored, where they're processed, can result in memory loss. So two types of memory loss. One is anterograde amnesia. So this is when older memories are preserved, but the person can't make any new memories. So essentially they live in the here and now. So if you've ever seen the movie 50 First Dates, the 5-second Tom, he had anterograde amnesia. Whereas retrograde amnesia means that you lose memories formed in the past. So old memories you already had are gone. So we can monitor brain activity and look at brain wave patterns with an EEG or an electroencephalogram. So electro meaning electricity, encephalo meaning brain, gram meaning a graph. So we can just record and graph the electrical activity that accompanies our brain function. So this is used to diagnose various sleep disorders, things like epilepsy. Also allows us to locate injuries or lesions, tumors, what have you, on locations on the brain. Also used in research to determine brain death, so we can determine if someone is still technically alive, if they're still in there based on their brain activity. So some common patterns of brain waves include alpha waves. So these are kind of your awake but relaxed, idling brain. So just kind of relaxed on the couch, not really doing any deep thinking or studying. Beta waves are when you're awake and now you're mentally alert. Right? So your awareness is a little higher of what's going on around you, and you're thinking a little bit more. So theta waves are common in children, kind of this erratic pattern, but uncommon in awake adults. So they're more common in children because if you think kids' brains are growing at a much faster rate during childhood, making new connections. So delta waves are your deep sleep waves. So this occurs because when you're sleeping, you're not having all this incoming stimuli. The reticular formation, or reticular activating system is suppressed. However, if you see this delta wave pattern in an awake adult, it could indicate brain damage. So consciousness is just that annoying time between naps. So it involves a perception of the sensation, a voluntary initiation and control of your movement, as well as some higher mental processing capabilities. So things like memory, judgment, logic, etc. So, with the exception of sleep, a loss of consciousness would signal that brain function is somehow impaired. So, fainting or syncope is when you just have a brief loss of consciousness. Right, so this is most often due to inadequate blood flow to the brain, low blood pressure, severe emotional stress. So sometimes just if you stand up too fast, right, that can kind of lower temporarily the blood flow to your brain and you feel a little lightheaded and dizzy and may faint. However, a coma would be this unconscious period for an extended period of time. So it's not the same as deep sleep because actual oxygen consumption is lowered as well. So looking at some protections of the brain, so these include the meninges or the protective layers of the brain surface. So functions of the meninges just include to cover and protect that central nervous system, as well as enclose and protect the blood vessels, be a containment for cerebrospinal fluid, and form partitions or just different sections inside the skull. So there's three main layers of the meninges going from outside to inside. We have the dura mater, which is the outermost layer, so it's the durable layer, the arachnoid mater in the middle, and the PIA mater. So the PIA mater is going to just actually touch the surface, line the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. So the dura mater, we said, was the durable layer. It's the strongest of the meninges, and it's made up of 2 layers of fibrous connective tissue. So if you look at the structure of the dura mater, you can tell just by looking at it, it's a very tough fibrous tissue. The arachnoid mater is this middle layer with these spider web-like extensions. So the subarachnoid space here is going to be filled with that cerebrospinal fluid. Right? So subarachnoid space here, as well as some blood vessels in the brain. And these arachnoid granulations are going to kind of protrude through the dura mater and make contact with that superior sagittal sinus to drain some of that cerebrospinal fluid back into the blood and filter it. The PIA Mater is the delicate connective tissue that's going to cling very tightly to the surface of the brain along every convolution. So every groove and fissure and sulcus is going to be covered by this PIA Mater. So a homeostatic imbalance involving the meninges is called meningitis. So this would just be an inflammation of those meningeal layers. So this inflammation can spread to the central nervous system, which could lead to ultimately inflammation of the brain. So then it would progress to encephalitis. So typically meningitis can be diagnosed by testing the cerebrospinal fluid. So we can actually culture cerebrospinal fluid and see if there are any microbes or bacteria living in there to cause this infection. So this is done or obtained via a lumbar puncture. So they take the large needle, stick it in between the vertebrae just to this area here and take a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is going to help form kind of this liquid cushion around the brain and the spinal cord. So it maintains a relatively constant volume. Also gives some buoyancy to these central nervous system structures. So it helps reduce the weight of the brain ultimately by 97%. So the brain is basically just kind of floating in your skull in this fluid. So it also acts kind of as an insulator, so it protects from any blows or trauma. Also helps to nourish the brain and carry those chemical signals around. So it's primarily composed of water formed from the blood plasma, but just with less of the plasma proteins and none of the blood cells, different ion concentrations for the central nervous system's functions. So we mentioned before, cerebrospinal fluid is formed in the choroid plexus. So this is just a cluster or little groups of capillaries that hang from each ventricle. Remember, the ventricles are the fluid-filled cavities. So the cerebrospinal fluid is filtered pretty much at a constant rate, and then the ependymal cells will use their cilia to help sweep and keep this fluid in motion, keep it circulating. So hydrocephalus is a homeostatic imbalance when there's some type of obstruction that's blocking the normal circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. So this is going to result in increased intracranial pressure. So in newborns, since their skulls aren't fused yet, this can cause their heads to enlarge. In adults, the skull is already fused and very rigid, so it would just lead to very high pressure inside the brain, potentially causing brain damage. So the treatment is to drain this fluid with a ventricular shunt, so it empties out into the abdominal cavity, where then it would just be passed through the body and reabsorbed. So how the shunt works is we have a tube that's basically going to reroute and divert this fluid out of the ventricle system. So the blood-brain barrier helps maintain that stable chemical environment of the central nervous system. So any Slight inconsistencies of our chemical compositions could lead to uncontrollable neuron firings. So remember, those action potentials, those electrical signals are very dependent on the ion concentrations, how much sodium, how much chlorine, how much potassium are in that fluid. So we have exceptionally impermeable tight junctions to help keep the brain separated from a lot of blood-borne substances. So hardly anything is going to be able to pass through. It's going to be very difficult to pass from the blood into the actual brain tissue. So in order to reach the brain, the substance has to pass through at least 3 layers to get entry to the neuron. So we have the endothelium of the blood vessel, the capillary, so this inner lining, the thick basal lamina, so kind of the thick outer layer of the capillary, and then the feet or the podocytes of the astrocytes. So these feet processes that are going to cling to the capillaries and cling to the neurons. Remember we said astrocytes were the most abundant neuroglia, and they help to attach the neurons to the nutrient source in the capillaries and kind of regulate what is removed from the blood and what is not. So it is a very selective barrier, but it's not 100% absolute. So it does allow certain nutrients to move through facilitated diffusion. Some products like metabolic waste, toxins, some drugs typically are going to be denied access to the brain. However, a lot of fat-soluble substances can pass through. So things like alcohol, nicotine, anesthetics can cross through that barrier. So some regions of the central nervous system, like we said, have no blood-brain barrier, essentially. So like the hypothalamus, the medulla, where they have to monitor the blood composition and other factors to trigger that vomiting reflex if necessary. Okay, so continuing on looking at the spinal cord. So gross anatomy, the spinal cord we know is just enclosed and protected by the vertebrae, so the vertebral column. So it's going to begin at the foramen magnum where we exit the skull and go all the way down to the lumbar vertebrae. So the spinal cord essentially is the two-way communication highway from the brain and the body. It's going to contain a lot of your major reflex centers. So a lot of your everyday reflexes really don't even have to go all the way to the brain. The spinal cord can handle some reflexes, some responses like that. So some gross anatomy. So the spinal cord is protected by the bone of the vertebrae. It also has some meningeal protection. So it has the same dura mater, arachnoid mater, PIA mater. The epidural space is this cushion of fat and some blood vessels in between the vertebrae and the dura mater. So we just have an extra layer of cushioning of fat to help pad that delicate spinal cord. And then, of course, your cerebrospinal fluid is going to fill this subarachnoid space surrounding the spinal cord. So spinal nerves are considered part of the peripheral nervous system, but they're going to come off of the spinal cord in these paired roots, so one on each side, dorsal and ventral. So you can see we have a cervical enlargement, so a region of the spinal cord that's a little bit thicker near the neck region, and then it's a little thin in the middle, and then we have another enlargement or thickening near the lumbar region. So this would be where your major nerves for the arms and the legs would come off of this region of the spinal cord. So the cauda equina, or equina is an equine, so horse. Cauda means tail. So the horse tail is just the collection of nerve roots at the very inferior end of this vertebral canal.